We have a real treat today. A King's Gambit played at the highest levels. Hikaru Nakamura plays a King's Gambit against Magnus Carlsen at Norway Chess. Now, this was the Armageddon game. The way Norway Chess works is if your classical time control game is a draw, you have an Armageddon game, and they'll switch colors, so you get the opposite color of what you had in the classical game. White gets 10 minutes, black gets 7 minutes, but black has draw odds. So Hikaru had black in the main classical game. He played a martial attack. It was a draw. And so in this game, he has the white pieces. Carlsen has black. And Hikaru, in other words, has to win this game with the white pieces. A draw is not good enough. Let's jump right in to this exciting game. Hikaru plays e4, e5, and then the surprise move f4, the King's Gambit. Magnus Carlsen takes it. After knight f3, he could play d5, which is a little bit safer, but he goes right into the main line, g5, holding on to that f4 pawn and daring Hikaru to attack. h4 attacking the base of the pawn chain. Now g4 kicks the knight. This is all mainline theory. Knight to e5, aiming at the g4 square. The queen and the knight both aim at it. d6, and now he takes the g4 pawn. Knight to f6. Knight to f6 check, and queen to f6. Now, so far, we are following down the path of the absolute main line of the King's Gambit accepted. Now, here, normally, knight to c3 is played with the threat of jumping into d5, gaining a tempo against the queen at f6, and it's a good move. Hikaru plays a different idea. He plays d3, opening up the pressure against the f4 pawn. He wants to go right after that pawn as quickly as possible. Knight to c6, and here is the novelty of the game. At least in my database, it's a novelty. Queen to f3. Previously, knight to c3 was played, but queen to f3, going right after that pawn on f4. It's attacked twice. He does have to worry about this knight on c6 gaining a tempo against the queen on the d4 square, though. Magnus, first of all, defends it with bishop to h6, so the pawn is attacked twice, defended twice. And Hikaru, anticipating the knight jump into the d4 square, retreats the queen to f2, a nice, comfortable location for the queen, dealing with the knight to d4 threat. Rook to g8, played by Magnus, controlling that half-open file, putting some pressure on the very weak g3 square in white's position. Now the knight does come to c3. It can go to d5, hit the queen. So to prevent that, Magnus plays bishop to e6. That helps him to control this d5 square if the knight lands on it. And Nakamura plays bishop to d2, and we can see his idea. He wants to castle long. Of course, Magnus has the same idea. He has all these weaknesses on the king's side, so he doesn't want his king to be over there either. But long castle is prepared. Magnus castles long, and then Hikaru castles long. And here, Magnus plays queen to d4. Now, from a strictly theoretical point of view, Nakamura should probably take that queen. The computers give black a slight edge, but nothing spectacular, and he probably could have a draw here. His dilemma, as I mentioned in the introduction, is that a draw isn't good enough. He has to win with the white pieces. He got 3 more minutes of time, but the burden is, and he got the first move with white, the burden is he has to win. So he avoids the exchange of queens by playing queen to e1. The queen goes to e5. Magnus is trying to establish some dominance over these central dark squares. It looks like he has established dominance over those squares. Hikaru plays knight to e2, again aiming at the f4 pawn, and also again trying to compete a little bit on those central dark squares. And here Magnus played f5. It turns out the best move here was d5, and it's quite a bit better than f5 for a little tactical reason. If e d5, queen d5, he's aiming at the a2 pawn after bishop are exchanged, queen to a2. We can see black is better because he's going to be harassing the white king. But instead, let's say g3, taking advantage of this pin against this bishop on h6, then the bishop can go to g7, aiming at b2. But Nakamura would like to play bishop to c3, but in this case, d4 can be played. And here, black is just completely winning. And that's why d5 was better than f5, because he can play d4 in this particular variation. So after f5, again, g3 is played, taking advantage of that pin. And here, if bishop to g7, bishop to c3 works, because there's no pawn on d5 to advance to the d4 square. That was little computer-esque subtlety in the position. So instead of playing bishop to g7, fe4 is played by Magnus. Pawn takes on f4, queen to f5, now knight to g3, hitting the queen. The queen goes back to f7. You can see the queen and bishop battery aiming at the a2 pawn. Here, knight to e4, with the possibility of jumping into g5, was a strong idea. Nakamura plays f5, hitting that bishop. Carlsen exchanges dark squared bishops. Rook takes d2, and actually, if Magnus takes on a2, after knight e4, white is fine in this position. He doesn't have that much to worry about because the bishop can't really harass the king. If the queen were on a2, that would be a different story. But the bishop on a2 is not as big of a problem. So Carlsen plays bishop to d7, instead clearing the way for the queen to take on a2, and that would be a problem. So Hikaru plays king to b1 to defend that a2 square. The knight goes into e5, threatening knight to f3, of course, which forks the queen and the rook. Queen to e3 evades that, but now taking on d3. And bishop takes d3 was probably the best move. It keeps the pawns a little bit healthier. By the way, if queen takes a7, bishop c6, and the king can tuck here, and black would be fine in that case. But Hikaru takes with the pawn, and that does weaken his king a little bit. It does give his knight a little bit of support in the center, though. Bishop to c6, attacking the h1 rook. Knight to e4, blocks that attack. The king goes to b8 now to cover that a2 square. Bishop to h3 defends the f5 pawn. Rook d to e8. The rook is placed opposite the queen. Rook to c1. Bishop to d5, again threatening. Bishop takes a2 check. And here, by the way, if he plays a move like a3, then after knight takes d3, black is completely winning. If, say, rook d3, bishop takes e4, the rook is pinned. So that threat of knight takes d3 keeps him from just playing a3. Instead, he plays rook to e2 to help keep additional defense for the knight. So bishop to a2 check is played now because he had to defend against knight d3. King goes to a1, bishop back to d5, knight to g5 hits the queen, queen to d7, threatening to play queen to a4 check and cause all sorts of problems on the king's side. So queen to d4 keeps the queen out of a4, but queen to b5. Magnus just wants his queen hovering around Hikaru's king. He wants that queen over there. That doesn't matter what square he's on right now. He just wants the king over there. The king shifts to b1, so there's no easy check. Knight to c6 hits the queen. First he exchanges rooks because it's with check. Now the queen goes back to c3. And here Magnus plays this strong idea, bishop to b3, covering the flight squares for the king, and he would love to just play something as simple as queen a4, queen a2, checkmate. So Hikaru has to do something about that threat. He plays the knight to e4, and when queen to a4 is played, he plays rook to f1. This way the king can run away to c1 and escape the threats. But Magnus plays knight to d4 with all sorts of threats on c2, potential threats of if the king goes to c1, he could play a knight to e2 check, forking the king and the queen, all sorts of nasty threats here. Bishop to g4 covers that e2 square, so there is no, he can deal with a fork in that case. He plays bishop to c2 check. Computers like this move knight to c2, obviously threatening queen to a1 mate. After king c1, knight to e3, it's the rook and the bishop, and this is the idea behind the variation. You play rook to g1 to defend the bishop and move the rook away from the threat, but then when you take and rook recaptures in this idea, queen a1 check, king d2, and then queen d1 check, double attacks the king and the rook, king moves queen g4, and black would be winning. But instead, Magnus plays bishop to c2 check, king to c1, queen to a1 check, king d2, and now queen takes f1. Magnus Carlsen wins the exchange, gets the rook, but white gets to take the knight on d4. But now bishop to d3 with all sorts of threats. The knight goes to f6, attacking the rook, and then this really nice shot from Magnus decides the game. He plays rook to e2 check, and in this position, Nakamura resigned. Let's take a look why. Let's say he plays king takes bishop, then queen to d1 check, king to c3, rook to c2 check, king to b3, and then this would cleanly win the game. Rook takes b2. It's a double check, so we would have to take the rook with the king. He couldn't take with the queen because of the double check, but after king takes, queen check, then you pick up the knight, and that is decisive material. So Magnus Carlsen faced Nakamura's King's Gambit, played the main line, took the pawn, and defended and played very well. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.